how does one go about then trying to recreate or re-envisage a future, a new narrative, a story for oneself, when the kind of main points in the story have moved or disappeared?
Yeah. Well, your metaphor of the architecture of life changing is actually a wonderful place to attempt an answer to that, because here in Portland, and particularly in further west in our state, we had been ravaged also in 2020 by terrible wildfires that literally burned whole communities to the ground. Towns ceased to exist in the inferno. This was true in California as well. And this certainly made world headlines because of the enormity of the damage. In some ways, depending on, of course, the profundity of the grief and the profundity of the relationship or aspect of one's life lost to us, the grief might be analogized to a house fire that is extinguished before great damage is done, or, as in the case of the Oregon and California fires, a fire that levels us right down to our foundations. And so the task that we face, Liesl, can be one of needing to build our lives again from the ground up, that we may go back to the foundation stones and try to reassert the same house plan that was originally in place. But most commonly, we have to adapt to the changed circumstance. Sometimes we have to change residence altogether, and there's no repair and no rebuilding possible. So this is the radical challenge of grieving, is that it can reduce us to our very foundations. It requires us to look deeply at what those are. What are the core constituents of our lives? What matters to us, what always has, what still will, as we lean into a changed future. And it sometimes points us toward both the necessity and the possibility of a life very different than the one we had. If we are a parent who loses our only child, and perhaps we are beyond an age where we are likely to bear more children, then the life redesign required there is enormous. And of course, even if one were to lose a child under any circumstance, the life redesign is immense. And it's one that we do not easily take up. We are typically very reluctant to alter those attachments to the people, places, and possessions that we have loved and lost. So in grief, we stand in a state of almost ambivalence or inner contradiction. Part of us wants to hold fast to things just as they were, and yet an eternity will not return us to that earlier lifetime, at least in an earthly sense. And so in this earthly sense, we are forced to adapt. And of course, we may maintain loving bonds to the people and things that we have loved and lost physically, but every bereaved person will tell you that it is certainly not the same. However sweet the memory of the loved one, however they might enjoy continuing to circulate their stories, it's still a far cry from a human hug.
And so it's part of the one of the barriers, we might say, to meaning making and kind of somehow accepting the reality of a person's death, the wish to hang on to that relationship in the same form that one has had it, that there's a kind of resistance to the way that has to change in order to accommodate the reality of their death.
That's beautifully said. I do think that, among other things, grief takes the form of an urgent dialogue with ourselves, with one part wanting to stand firm, dig in our heels, and refuse the change that life is pressing upon us, while another part recognizes the necessity of that. And this is not to say, of course, that our changed life, our new life, maybe our reduced life, cannot also have a, you know, a very important place, maybe even a very central place for the very people we have loved and lost physically. But we need not lose them psychologically, emotionally, in some sense relationally. With or without a spiritual cosmology that promises an afterlife of reconnection, or a kind of quasi-literal dialogue with them in another dimension or in heaven, we still can retain a profound sense of connection and loving bond to those we've loved and lost. Learning how to do that might be at the heart of grief.
Yeah.
How do we move to reconstruct rather than relinquish a bond?